Coming in at number 10, we have the Judas cradle. If there's anything that the Middle Ages was advanced in, it was how to inflict horrible pain on a person. Suffering and fear were great tools to govern people back then, and anyone in power back then would have wielded it to make sure that everyone was under their control. One of the ways that they were able to do this was through the Judas cradle, a horrible device that was shaped like a pyramid. It would be placed under the bum of whoever was unfortunate enough to be placed upon it. It would be raised into the air, and then weights would be tied to the feet of the person to pull them down onto the pyramid. So as you can imagine, this sharp wooden pyramid would go up your butt. This would slowly stretch you from the bottom until you ripped open. This process would be slow and painful. Just the sight of this thing would strike fear into your heart. But if you were one of the people in medieval Europe who was in charge of administering this punishment, you would have bathed in their fear. Bringing them into the horrible room with the Judas cradle would have enlightened them to the great darkness. And guys, make sure you hit that like button. Coming in at number 9, we have eating slugs. I mean, there wasn't a ton of food around, so sometimes you had to make do with what you had. But the scary thing about eating slugs is that it wasn't something you would do even if you had plenty of grub to go around. See, there was a discovery made back in the Dark Ages. It was that slugs could eat a plant known as wolfsbane. For those of you who don't know, wolfsbane has a powerful toxin in it known as aconite. This will give you a pretty slow and painful death, and it used to be used all the time. But someone saw that there was a certain species of slug that loved to munch down on wolfsbane. Now this would mean one of two things. Either the slugs were packed full of aconite and would kill you if you ingested them, or this would mean that these slugs have some sort of immunity that would help them break down the poison. So an experiment was done and a probably disgusting dish was made called slug soup. After eating the soup, it was revealed that the body would have an immunity to aconite. I would have hated to be the person who was the test subject for this experiment. First, you would have to eat a slug, and then you would have to get poisoned, hoping that your last meal would save your life, and if it didn't, the last thing you would have ever eaten would have been a slug. Okay, coming in at number 8, we have little sperm people. Okay, this one isn't really scary because of how horrible it is, but it's more of how stupid people used to be, and this one is kind of funny. So back when we knew very little about our reproductive organs, it was believed that there was already a baby in sperm, that a little baby lived in your sperm, and when you made hanky-panky with the lady, you sent it inside her body where the baby would grow until it was ready to come out. There were even old drawings of babies inside sperm. The funny thing is they did get the shape of sperm right. Maybe we just know in our hearts that sperm is a little raindrop shape. Coming in at number 7, we have marriage. When we meet someone now, we fall in love, and that will probably lead to marriage, or you'll just have a thing where you meet up every other weekend until you both fade to dust. But back in the Dark Ages, there wasn't the same kind of love. Actually, people rarely had a say in who they got to marry. This would happen when you were quite young, and you would be married off to strengthen your family. If you fell in love with someone who was not from much money, but your family was quite wealthy, then you better believe your parents wouldn't let you marry them. Why do you think there are so many stories written about forbidden love in this way? It's a little scary to think that you would have such little say over who you get to be with for the rest of your life. And back then, if you got caught cheating, it would probably lead to jail time. Coming in at number 6, we have no one breaks the law. If you broke the law back in the day, just like now, you would go to court. You might have to sit in a dungeon for an extended period of time before you were seen in court, but there was still some sort of system to give out justice. But one of the strangest parts about this was that humans were not the only ones who had to follow the law. It was animals too. There are several records of animals being taken to court to figure out if they were guilty for a crime. Now, you might think this is silly because it definitely is, but the crimes definitely weren't. More often than not, crimes were committed by pigs. And you're about to learn some stuff about the little pink food source that might make it hard to look at them the same way ever again. There are some stories of pigs killing people and then being taken to court for murder. Yeah, I could see how people would want to seek justice after one of their family members was murdered by a pig. You would be pretty sour if you came home one day and one of the people you love was gone because a pig got out of its pen and went crazy. Coming in at number 5, we have being drunk all the time. We are lucky enough to live in a time where it's a lot easier to get clean drinking water. Well, for some of the world. It's still shocking how much of the planet doesn't have access to clean drinking water. And because of this, we know that when you don't drink water that has been sterilized, you can get very sick. Well, that was definitely the situation back in the Dark Ages. Unless you found some running water coming down from a mountain, there was a good chance that the water could kill you or make you very, very ill. So people turned to the next best thing, booze. See, people knew that because of the alcohol content that you wouldn't get sick from drinking beer or wine instead of water. Well, you would still get hungover, but you wouldn't get cholera. I just don't think that would be the life I would want to live. Could you imagine you spend all night drinking and then you go to bed, you wake up with a splitting headache because you're so hungover, and then the only thing you have to drink is more beer? I guess life back then was so hard you wouldn't even realize that you weren't feeling well. Coming in number 4, we have famine. If clean drinking water didn't kill you, then how hard it was to come by food might kill you after that. There were several famous famines throughout the Dark Ages that led to people getting very desperate. This usually led to people fighting with one another and areas being wiped out because there was not enough food to go around. And there was very little control over this. A slight change in the weather, too much rain or too little, the year being too hot, a fire breaking out, and in some cases bugs on the loose. Some sort of sickness or even war could lead to a poor yield and massive famine. Yeah, it was not an easy time to be alive. Coming in at number 3, we have going to the doctor. There are many ways you can seek help now. If you're not feeling well, you could go to a general practitioner. You could go to a naturopath. If you have some aches and pains, you could go check out an osteopath or a physiotherapist. There are so many ways you can get help now, but back in the day, going to the doctor could have been one of the worst things for your health. Doctors back then practiced some pretty primitive ways of healing people, like bloodletting, where they would drain blood from a person's body because they thought you had bad blood. It would be like, no dude, I need the most blood possible. If anything, I want extra blood. Well, that is probably bad too, but I don't know the science. Something else they would do was trepanning, which was drilling a hole into the head, which was supposed to help with mental illness. Think of a lobotomy, but even more graphic. Coming in number 2, we have executions. There's a lot of ways people would take you out back then. If you were seen as guilty of a crime, there would be a good chance that you would be taken to a guillotine and have your head removed from your body. This was the fastest and easiest way to get rid of people who were given the death sentence. But believe it or not, those were the lucky ones. It would seem that people who committed crimes against the crown, like treason, would have a fate worse than death. Those people would be dragged to the streets by a horse, and that wasn't even to kill them. That was just to get them to the place where their fate would have been finalized. Once they arrived beaten and bruised, they would have some form of prolonged painful death, like a slow hanging, pulled by horses, disembowelment, or all of the above. The people would be reminded that anyone who tried to cross the royals would wish they hadn't. Again, fear was the best way to keep people in line. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the Black Plague, probably one of the most tragic moments in human history. The hardest correction that any disease that we know of has ever been able to hit mankind with. People being extremely unclean, rats running through the streets, a lack of proper sewage, no understanding of cleanliness. All of these things led to the Black Plague. A disease running through poop and dead bodies was able to mutate and attach itself to rats. Those rats ran through the streets endlessly to spread it, and nearly every person in Europe caught it. People would get boils all over their body. Their breathing would become labored. They would have blood and pus leak out of every inch of them before they passed. Bodies were burned in mass to try and contain the sickness. People thought that it could have been an act of God, something punishing them for who knows what. Eventually, the Europeans were able to push through this, but not before it took out 1/3 of Europe. It's suspected that this wasn't the last they saw of this plague. The London plague could have been the same strain of the sickness, as well as several other small outbreaks that happened over the next few centuries. Coming in at number 10, we have the saw. Yeah, this was one of the most brutal ways that they would dispense out pain during the Dark Ages. Let me play out the whole scene for you. You get arrested for something serious, and now they want information out of you, and they are going to do this in the most painful way possible. So they drag you into a dungeon, you would be butt naked, and just for added effect, imagine that it's cold. Then they would tie a rope to each one of your legs and then hoist you up so that you're upside down with your legs spread apart and you're nude. Now comes the most horrifying part of the whole thing. You remember that massive saw that people would use to cut down trees? Those things that would take 2 men pushing back and forth to cut through a big old oak tree? Yeah, one of those would be used to slice you in half from the butt to your head. Easily one of the most painful ways that you could go. The wild thing about the saw is that it wasn't originally made for trees and then used on people. It's the other way around. People's obsession with being sadistic is what caused this all to happen. Coming in at number 9, we have Saint Edmund. Back in the Dark Ages, it must have been really hard to make friends. It would seem that anytime you ran into a person, you had to worry about if they were going to kill or rob you. You could never trust anyone, but Saint Edmund had a different way of looking at things. When the Vikings were invading England, he thought that he could show them the right way and thought that he could convert them to his religion, and then from there they would be great buddies and they would hang out and talk about life and all the good stuff. Well, it turns out that the Vikings weren't as understanding as he thought. The Vikings attacked Saint Edmund, they tied him to a tree and then fired arrows at him. Then they cut off his head and threw it into a forest. That's not funny, but for some reason it's just because he was like, I'm gonna convert these people, and they're like, actually we're gonna cut your head off. That's actually what's gonna happen. They weren't really nice about it. This was obviously a huge insult because back then if you weren't given a proper burial, then people thought bad things would happen. And I don't know if you guys have read up on this, but cutting a guy's head off and throwing it into a forest isn't really a proper burial. Coming in at number 8, we have the rack. If you thought things couldn't get any worse, well, let me tell you that they definitely can. Probably the thing that did best in the Dark Ages was finding more and more ways to inflict pain onto the body of a person in a slow and painful way. It's like everyone just sat around all day daydreaming about devices that would rip your body apart, and at one point someone came up with the rack. Think of a big wooden slab that has ropes on the top and bottom of it. These ropes are attached to cranks. They would be tied to your hands and feet, and then you would be stretched until your bones and joints and limbs start to pull apart. I can imagine that for the first few cranks it would feel pretty good, like you would relax your whole body and just let it pull on your limbs. It would be like getting a good stretch, like maybe this thing was actually built for a good cause. Maybe some dude was just like, I want to get a good stretch in, and he was the original chiropractor. But then some evil king saw this, and the guy was like, well, that would be extremely painful, but why would you want to do this? This is only for making people feel good. And the king then had the guy killed and then stole his idea. That would have been how it all went down, I'm sure. I'm a great historian. Coming in at number 7, we have no pleasure during procreation. Now some of you watching know all about the hanky-panky, and some of you might not, but regardless, you probably know that people do it for fun more than they do it to make a baby. That's why we have invented things like condoms, because making a baby is only fun when you really want to, and you shouldn't have to worry about knocking boots and making a baby that you don't want. Back in the Dark Ages, there was a law that you were not allowed to get down and dirty unless it was for the purpose of having a kid, and you weren't allowed to experience any pleasure when you were hooking up, even if it was for the purpose of having a kid. This was because of something that God said, I think. I don't know who came up with this law, but this is a dumb one. That's like telling someone to eat food but they're not allowed to taste anything. The good thing about this is that this time period is dead and you don't need to worry about going to jail because you had fun with your partner. Coming in at number 6, we have the Pear of Anguish. Now I had to throw this one on the list because the name sounds amazing. Like it's a pear of anguish. That sounds like a fruit you bite into that has a worm in it and you sulk around for the rest of the day because you got grossed out. But it turns out that this pear was way more brutal than that. The Pear of Anguish was something that kind of looked like a big metal pickle, and it had a screw on the end of it. Now what it would be used for was punishing people for various reasons, but this is how it would be used. It would either be pushed into the mouth or the bum of a person, and then the pickle end that was inside your body would start to expand, and the thing probably wouldn't even kill you. It would just feel horrible and leave you crippled. You probably would get an infection and pass away from something later. Coming in at number 5, we have how long you gonna live. Right now you can hope to live until you're an old fart. You can putter around your whole life and maybe come out to the other side as a little old dude who goes to Denny's and sits in the corner by himself and drinks coffee and thinks about how he's all alone in the world as time passes him by. You could be that one day if you're lucky, but back in the Dark Ages there was no way that you would be able to make it to that age. If you lived that long you would probably be accused of being a witch and then taken somewhere to be burned at the stake. Back then the average age that a man would live was somewhere around 31. I'm 28 right now. Could you imagine that? I would already be near the end of my life. Man, there's still so much I want to do. I've never even been to Disney World. How could I die before I spent $20 on a hot dog and then threw up that hot dog on some kid's head while I was on a roller coaster? But if I was born in the Dark Ages, I wouldn't be able to live much longer to go to Disneyland. That's why it was called the Dark Ages back then. You wouldn't even get to go to Disneyland. Coming in at number 4, we have the coffin cage. Man, they had endless ways of making your life horrible back in the day. Maybe if they focused on making people feel good, there wouldn't have been so much violence. I'm just kidding. Back then, humans were brutal creatures, and if you were nice to others, it probably would have led to you being on the bad end of these punishments. Like when the dude got his head cut off and then thrown into the forest. See, he tried to be nice, but that's what happens. Back then, you had to be ruthless if you were someone who got caught for a crime and people didn't want to kill you, but they wanted you to be imprisoned and on display for the whole world to abuse. They might put you in a caged coffin. Basically, think of a bird cage that is so tight you can't move. So it's hugged around your body like a coffin, but everyone can see inside of there. Then they would hang you up somewhere where everyone could see you, and anyone could come through and shame you or abuse you while you were stuck inside that cage. It would combine shame and torture in a way that's almost impressive. Coming in at number 3, we have servitude to the king. Some people think that back in the Dark Ages, you could just find a house in the countryside and then just live out there without any problems. You would grow your grain and then have your own cattle, and that would be your life, living off the land and working with your hands. Well, that was not the case at all, unless you were able to hide, which would be hard to do because you would need to start a fire to cook some meat, so people patrolling the countryside would see all that smoke coming off of your little home. But if anyone knew where you were, you would have to pay tax to the king, which would be a ton of what you were bringing in. In some cases, they would take the majority. Sometimes you even had to go to the king if you wanted to even get married. Think about that, if you had to ask the president or the prime minister for permission to get married. But when you look at how taxes are taxed right now and how little income you actually get to keep, things don't really seem that different, do they? And how did they solve this problem? Well, that was through massive revolution. I'm not saying we should have a revolution, I'm just saying it might lower taxes. And coming in number 2, we have the head crusher. Now this horrible tool didn't have as inventive as a name as the pear of anguish, but trust me, it was one of the worst things on this list. So what the head crusher is doing is exactly what you think that it would be doing, which is crushing your head. Your head would be placed on a wooden plank, and then a metal cap would be put on the top of your head. The cap would then be cranked down and turned onto your head, and the force would be crushed onto your head until your head exploded. Yeah, unlike the rack where maybe you could make the argument that it made people feel good for a moment, I don't think you could convince anyone that this thing was created for anything other than nefarious purposes. So I would have to say that I think this one was only used for horrible things. How could you even be the person who turned the crank? You would have to watch a dude's head literally explode. That's disgusting. Coming in at number 1, we have life was unstable. There was really nothing you on back then. One year you might have a massive famine which led to not enough food to go around, and then war would break out and there would be blood running in the streets. Or you could get a greedy evil king that would get into power, which would lead to civil unrest and there would be blood running through the streets. There might even be an invading country which would lead to a massive war and blood running in the streets. There might have been a new religion in power that would force you to change your beliefs, and some people would push back again, which would lead to blood running in the streets. So basically the world was constantly trying to kill you back then.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Spanish donkey. During the Dark Ages, it seemed like people loved extreme methods of torture / execution. I mean, the victims didn't love it, but the executioners and people of power certainly had fun with these disturbing contraptions, like the Spanish donkey, otherwise known as the wooden horse. This device consisted of angled pieces of wood with sharp points attached to it. The victim was then forced to mount this naked, as if they were riding a horse. The sharp points would dig into their bare flesh. Sometimes weights were even added to the victim's feet to force them down more onto the spikes. Apparently, there are accounts of the wedges slicing entirely through the victim. Yikes, that would be extremely painful.
Coming in at number 9, but before I reveal it, be sure to press that like button for us and be sure to subscribe for more because you know you love it. Coming in at number 9, we have Pope Stephen VI, who dug up his enemy and put him on trial. This isn't terrifying in the traditional slasher gore horror sense, but more in the what in the actual heck was this guy thinking so ridiculous it's terrifying kind of way. The trial was called the Cadaver Synod, or Synodus Horrenda, and took place at the Basilica San Giovanni Laterano. Pope Stephen VI put the rotting corpse of Pope Formosus on trial in 897. The trial consisted mainly of Pope Stephen just yelling insults and accusations at him while the jury watched in horror. They also dressed the deceased Formosus in papal garments, chopped off his 3 fingers on his hand, so these ones used for blessing, threw him in a river, and then burned his body. I mean, like, thank goodness the guy was already dead. Many believe that the trial was used mainly as a distraction from the horrors that Pope Stephen himself committed, adding on the fact that he was most likely insane. The people of Rome who followed Formosus then had Stephen incarcerated and strangled. I don't know, I guess that's what you get for killing a dead guy.
Moving on to number 8, we have the sleeping sickness. So in 1453, King Henry VI became mysteriously ill for 18 months. Some historians think the sickness that he was suffering from was catatonic schizophrenia, whereas others believe he was just going through a mental breakdown. We don't know for sure, but what he went through was quite strange. They called it the sleeping sickness. Basically, he slipped into an unresponsive state for a year and a half. He woke up and started behaving like a child. From then, he would often slip into an unresponsive state periodically for the rest of his life. Not only that, but he started to suffer physically as well. At one point, he couldn't move his limbs or support the weight of his own head. He would often be in a slouched over position. Again, we truly don't know what went on with him.
Next up at number 7, we have Mob Ball. Who doesn't love a bit of soccer, or football as the folks across the pond call it? Well, Mob Ball was pretty similar as far as game structures go. The ball was a leather bladder, and the goals were set at random distances apart, sometimes even miles apart. Anyone can join in, and there were no limits to how many players could try their hand at striking at the net. FIFA says the game started around the 8th century, and though it sounds innocent enough, it actually turns out there was a darker beginning to the whole thing. Before they had thought to use a liver, some stories say that the head of a Danish prince was once used. Guess they got, get your head in the game. Gotta get your head in the game.
Making our way down the list at number 6, we have the tuberculosis. Did you know back in the days, the touch of a king or queen was powerful enough to cure deadly diseases? Or so that's what they believed. Back in the day, a form of tuberculosis left a number of people with black lesions all over their neck. These would then rupture and leave nasty open sores. Well, it was believed that the touch of a king or queen would cure it all. It's believed that King Henry VI touched around 1,500 people. That sounds bad, but touched the illnesses, the disease, you know? Anyway, yet it's unknown how many people he actually cured with his magic touch. I can't imagine it was a lot, though.
Next up, we have some good old-fashioned witch hunting at number 5. Ironically, Pope Innocent VIII kicked it all off by putting forth a bill in 1484 that condemned witchcraft and sent inquisitors to Germany to try witches. He reportedly blamed them for the mini ice age and inclement weather that was occurring around that time. And we all know what happened to any who were found guilty. But the weird part is, despite the religiosity that hung in the air as thick as dense smoke around that time, many people were pretty skeptical of the existence of witches anyways. John of Salisbury even said in 1159, and I quote, "Who is so blind as not to see that this is all a mischievous illusion caused by demons? This is shown, if by nothing else, by the fact that it is always the simpler men and women and those less firm in the faith that believe these things." End quote. Though a couple centuries earlier, this certainly sounds like it definitely applies to Pope Not So Innocent VIII.
And at number 4, we have the breaking wheel. Another really messed up form of torture. This device was typically used during public executions. Basically, this device is like a wagon wheel with spokes. The victim was then strapped onto the wheel so that their limbs were woven between the spokes. Then the executioner would take a hammer and smash the victim's limbs. When they were hit, their limbs would give away and break due to how they were strapped onto the wheel. In other cases, the victim would be tied onto the outside of the wheel while their feet were tied to the ground. Then they would turn the wheel until their body breaks. It was very gruesome. And then their dead body was held up for everyone to see. How sick.
Next up, we have tithing. You think taxes are bad now? Well, at least the ones we pay in Canada help afford us some healthcare that won't kill us, which is a good thing. Tithes were taxes that you had to pay to the church either in actual gold or as part of your harvest. Tithe, meaning 1/10, meant that the church got around 10% of whatever you made. The bishops and priests had massive barns where they kept the tithes, and if you didn't pay it, then you would be excommunicated. Anyone who was excommunicated was left out in the cold to suffer and starve, and no one was allowed to speak to them. In a lot of ways, excommunication was worse than death, as everyone believed that if you couldn't go to church to confess your sins, you would be condemned to hell or purgatory, which was an awful thing to do.
Coming in at number 2, we have rat torture. And I promise you, it's just as bad as it sounds, if not worse. In fact, it's considered one of history's worst methods of torture. Basically, what would happen is that a rat was placed inside of a cage contraption, which was then hooked onto the victim's stomach. The cage was then slowly heated. The rat would start to panic and try to escape. The only way it could was to burrow through the victim's flesh. And that's what it would do. It would just claw at the victim's stomach and bite until it ends up inside their bowels. It's painful, it's disgusting, it's something straight out of your nightmares.
And last but not least, coming in at number 1, we have the fact that there was absolutely no plumbing. Guys, we were really stinky. If you've ever had a fantasy about being a medieval prince or princess in a castle, maybe pick an era after plumbing was introduced. Trust me, you'd want to stay miles away from that handsome knight who was about 3 more months away from his yearly bath. After the Black Plague, people thought bathing made them sick, so they just didn't do it anymore. They didn't connect the fact that they dumped their business in lakes and rivers where they bathed, so instead they just stopped it all together. On top of that, people used to throw their chamber pots over the balconies onto the streets or into the path of an unfortunate traveler. Very unfortunate. Imagine being pooped on by a bird. This is a lot worse. In fact, courteous men were expected to let women walk on the innermost part of the sidewalk in case anything unpleasant fell on the men. Sorry, you guys. People just let it pile up for weeks until King Edward II said that people were no longer allowed to dump poop in the road. Still, the tradition carried on, and only the wealthy had perfume to mask the smell, so...